Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the sweltering summer of 1991. The city's working-class neighborhoods hummed with the usual sounds of urban life, but beneath the surface, something unspeakably evil had been festering for over a decade. In a modest apartment building on North 25th Street, neighbors had grown accustomed to strange odors, odd noises, and the eccentric behavior of a quiet, pale man who kept to himself. They had no idea they were living next door to one of America's most depraved serial killers. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer wasn't the kind of monster that horror movies are made of. He didn't lurk in shadows or wear a mask. Instead, he was an ordinary-looking man who worked at a chocolate factory, paid his rent on time, and could be polite when the situation called for it. But behind his unremarkable facade lay a mind so twisted, so consumed by dark fantasies, that his crimes would shock even seasoned homicide detectives and redefine the very concept of evil in the American consciousness. This is the story of how an awkward, lonely child from the suburbs became the Milwaukee Cannibal, a man whose name would forever be synonymous with the darkest depths of human depravity. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. From the outside, the Dahmers appeared to be a typical middle-class American family. Lionel was a research chemist, intelligent and hardworking, while Joyce was a former teacher who had given up her career to raise their son. They lived in a comfortable home in West Allis, a suburb of Milwaukee, where Jeffrey spent his earliest years. But appearances, as Jeffrey's story would repeatedly demonstrate, could be devastatingly deceiving. Joyce Dahmer was a troubled woman, prone to severe mood swings and what would now be recognized as serious mental health issues. During her pregnancy with Jeffrey, she was prescribed numerous medications for anxiety and depression. The household was frequently tense, filled with arguments and emotional volatility. Little Jeffrey, sensitive and observant even as a toddler, absorbed this dysfunction like a sponge. As a young child, Jeffrey displayed unusual behavior that should have raised red flags. By age 4, he had become fascinated with dead animals. When he found roadkill or discovered dead creatures in the yard, instead of being repulsed or frightened like most children, Jeffrey was drawn to them with an almost scientific curiosity. He would poke at the corpses with sticks, examining their decomposition with intense interest. His father Lionel, perhaps trying to channel what he saw as his son's scientific inclinations, made a fateful decision. He began teaching Jeffrey about anatomy and chemistry, showing him how to preserve animal specimens and even demonstrating how to strip flesh from bones using chemicals. What Lionel intended as educational bonding time was actually providing his son with the technical knowledge he would later use in his horrific crimes. In 1966, when Jeffrey was 6 years old, the family moved to Doylestown, Ohio. The change of scenery did nothing to improve the family dynamics. If anything, the isolation of their new home seemed to amplify Jeffrey's growing strangeness and his parents' marital problems. Jeffrey's school years were marked by profound loneliness and social isolation. At Revere High School in Bath, Ohio, he was known as a weird, quiet kid who didn't fit in anywhere. He wasn't athletic, wasn't particularly academic despite his intelligence, and seemed to exist on the periphery of teenage social life. But Jeffrey had learned to cope with his isolation through alcohol. By age 14, he was drinking regularly, often sneaking alcohol to school in coffee cups or thermoses. His teachers noticed his odd behavior but attributed it to teenage rebellion rather than the deeper psychological problems that were festering beneath the surface. During these formative years, Jeffrey's sexual identity was also developing in disturbing ways. He realized he was gay, but in the conservative environment of 1970s Ohio, this realization brought him shame and confusion rather than acceptance. Worse still, his sexual fantasies began to merge with his fascination with death and control. He would later describe having elaborate fantasies about having complete power over other people, keeping them as willing companions who would never leave him. His first clear murderous fantasy involved a local jogger, a handsome young man who ran past the Dahmer house regularly. Jeffrey became obsessed with this stranger, planning to ambush him with a baseball bat, knock him unconscious, and then do things to him. The plan was detailed and sophisticated for a teenager, showing a level of premeditation that was deeply troubling. The only reason Jeffrey never acted on this fantasy was that the jogger changed his route. At home, things were deteriorating rapidly. His parents' marriage was falling apart in spectacular fashion. Joyce had become increasingly erratic, sometimes disappearing for days without explanation. Lionel was consumed with his work and seemed emotionally absent from his son's life. Jeffrey, meanwhile, was drinking more heavily and becoming increasingly withdrawn. His classmates at Revere High School would later remember him as a class clown of sorts, but his humor was always dark and inappropriate. He would fake epileptic seizures in the hallways, make bizarre noises during class, and generally behave in ways that kept people at a distance while ensuring he remained memorable. It was as if he had decided that being notorious was better than being invisible. In June 1978, just 3 weeks after graduating from high school, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. He was 18 years old, officially an adult but emotionally still very much a damaged child. The victim was Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker who made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride from Jeffrey. Stephen was attractive, friendly, and everything Jeffrey felt he could never be. He was also gay, though closeted, which added another layer of complexity to Jeffrey's attraction to him. Jeffrey brought Stephen back to his parents' house in Bath, Ohio. His mother had recently left for a vacation, and his father was away on business, leaving Jeffrey alone with his dark impulses for the first time. They drank beer, talked, and for a brief moment, Jeffrey experienced something resembling normal human connection. But when Stephen said he had to leave, something inside Jeffrey snapped. The idea of being abandoned again, of returning to his crushing loneliness, was unbearable. In a moment of rage and panic, Jeffrey struck Stephen in the head with a barbell, killing him instantly. What happened next revealed the true depth of Jeffrey's psychological disturbance. Instead of panicking or calling for help, Jeffrey felt a strange sense of calm and satisfaction. He had finally achieved the ultimate control over another person. Stephen would never leave him now. Jeffrey spent the next several hours with the body, touching it, examining it, fulfilling fantasies he had harbored for years. Then, drawing on the lessons his father had taught him about chemistry and anatomy, he began the grisly process of disposal. He dismembered Stephen's body in the basement, using acid to dissolve the flesh and crushing the bones into powder that he scattered in the woods behind the house. The process took several days, during which Jeffrey felt a mixture of sexual excitement and profound satisfaction. He had found his calling. After the murder of Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey entered what criminologists would later call his cooling-off period. For nearly 9 years, he didn't kill again, though this dormant period was marked by escalating deviant behavior and personal deterioration. His parents' divorce was finalized in 1978, with both Lionel and Joyce seemingly relieved to be free of each other. Jeffrey was left largely to fend for himself, bouncing between his parents' homes and struggling to find his place in the world. In January 1979, he enrolled at Ohio State University, but his alcoholism had progressed to the point where he was completely non-functional as a student. He attended few classes, failed most of his courses, and spent most of his time drinking alone in his dorm room. His roommates found him strange and antisocial, and he was eventually asked to leave the university. Desperate to give his son some structure and discipline, Lionel convinced Jeffrey to enlist in the U.S. Army in 1979. The military seemed like it might provide the rigid framework Jeffrey needed to get his life together. For a brief time, it appeared to work. Jeffrey was stationed in Germany as a medic, and his superiors initially found him to be a competent soldier. He was intelligent, followed orders, and seemed to adapt well to military life. But the army couldn't cure Jeffrey's fundamental problems. His drinking continued, and his fellow soldiers began to notice his odd behavior. He would disappear for hours at a time, returning with no explanation of where he had been. He collected photographs of attractive male soldiers and was suspected of entering their rooms while they slept. Most disturbing of all, there were reports that Jeffrey had drugged at least one fellow soldier, though the incident was never officially investigated. In 1981, Jeffrey was discharged from the army due to his alcohol problems and general unsuitability for military service. He returned to Ohio with no direction, no prospects, and a drinking problem that had only gotten worse. In 1982, Jeffrey moved to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer. This arrangement seemed promising at first. Catherine was a devoutly religious woman who provided Jeffrey with stability and genuine affection, perhaps the first healthy relationship he had ever experienced. Jeffrey got a job at a blood plasma center, where he was responsible for drawing blood from donors. The job seemed almost tailor-made for his disturbing interests, giving him legitimate access to human blood and the opportunity to interact with a vulnerable population. Co-workers would later recall that Jeffrey seemed particularly interested in the blood itself, sometimes staring at it with an intensity that made others uncomfortable. During his time living with his grandmother, Jeffrey began frequenting Milwaukee's gay bars and bathhouses. He was still deeply conflicted about his sexuality, but the anonymous nature of these encounters appealed to him. More troubling, he began experimenting with drugging potential partners, slipping sleeping pills into their drinks to render them unconscious. The thrill Jeffrey got from these incidents wasn't primarily sexual, it was about control. He would take photographs of his unconscious victims, positioning their bodies in ways that pleased him, creating a collection of images that fed his fantasies. Most of his victims never knew what had happened to them, waking up confused and disoriented but physically unharmed. But Jeffrey's needs were escalating. The temporary control he achieved through drugging wasn't enough anymore. He wanted something more permanent, more complete. In 1987, Jeffrey's behavior became too disruptive for even his patient grandmother to tolerate. Neighbors had been complaining about strange smells coming from the basement, and Catherine had found evidence of Jeffrey's drinking and odd experiments. Reluctantly, she asked him to find his own place. Jeffrey moved into a small apartment on Milwaukee's North 25th Street, in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. The location wasn't chosen for any racial reasons, it was simply cheap housing that Jeffrey could afford on his factory worker's salary. But the choice would have tragic consequences for the young Black and Latino men who would become his primary targets. Living alone for the first time since his grandmother's house, Jeffrey's restraints finally fell away completely. On September 15, 1987, he committed his second murder, nearly 9 years after killing Stephen Hicks. The victim was Stephen Twomey, a 24-year-old man Jeffrey met at a gay bar called Club 219. Jeffrey's memory of the actual murder was hazy. He claimed to have been extremely drunk and to have woken up in their hotel room to find Twomey dead beside him. Whether this was the truth or a careful lie, Jeffrey's response to finding the body revealed how much his pathology had progressed. Instead of panic or remorse, Jeffrey felt excited. He spent hours with Twomey's corpse, fulfilling sexual fantasies and taking photographs. Then he faced the practical problem of disposal. Purchasing a large suitcase, Jeffrey dismembered the body and transported it to his grandmother's house, where he had access to the basement and the chemicals he needed. The process of dismembering and disposing of Twomey's body gave Jeffrey intense satisfaction. He saved certain parts, the skull, some bones, as trophies, keeping them as mementos of his conquest. The rest he dissolved in acid or burned, techniques he had refined since his first murder nearly a decade earlier. After Twomey's murder, Jeffrey's killing spree began in earnest. The long dormant period was over, and his appetite for murder grew with each victim. His third victim was James Dockstader, a 14-year-old Native American boy Jeffrey met outside Club 219 in January 1988. Jeffrey lured the teenager to his grandmother's house with promises of money for posing for photographs. Once there, he drugged James, strangled him, and went through his now familiar ritual of sexual abuse, dismemberment, and disposal. The fact that James was only 14 years old marked a significant escalation in Jeffrey's crimes. Previously, his victims had been adults who had at least theoretically consented to go with him. With James, Jeffrey had crossed the line into child murder, showing that his inhibitions were completely eroding. 2 months later, Jeffrey killed again. Richard Guerrero, a 22-year-old man of Mexican descent, became victim number 4. The pattern was identical. Jeffrey met him at a bar, lured him home with promises of money for photos, drugged him, killed him, and disposed of the body. Jeffrey's grandmother was becoming suspicious of the strange smells and sounds coming from her basement, but Jeffrey always had explanations. He claimed to be taxidermy as a hobby, or conducting chemistry experiments left over from his army training. Catherine wanted to believe her grandson, and Jeffrey was skilled at manipulation and deception. In May 1988, Jeffrey was forced to move out of his grandmother's house permanently. His behavior had become too erratic, and there had been an incident where he was arrested for drugging and sexually assaulting a 13-year-old Laotian boy named Konorak Synthesumphone. Jeffrey received a minimal sentence, 1 year in prison with work release, but the incident made it clear he could no longer live with his grandmother. Upon his release in 1989, Jeffrey moved into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. This two-bedroom unit would become the primary scene of his most horrific crimes. The Oxford Apartments were a typical lower-income housing complex in a struggling neighborhood. Jeffrey's neighbors were mostly working-class Black and Latino families, people who minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about the strange smells or odd behavior of the quiet white man in 213. Jeffrey quickly established a routine that would define the next 2 years of his life. He worked the night shift at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company, which gave him his days free to hunt for victims and his nights free to commit his crimes after work. His co-workers at the factory found him odd but harmless. He was punctual, did his job adequately, and kept to himself. But it was during his off hours that Jeffrey's true nature emerged. He became a regular at Milwaukee's gay bars, particularly Club 219 and Phoenix Bar, where he was known as a quiet drinker who occasionally approached other patrons with offers of money for photographs or modeling work. As Jeffrey settled into his apartment, his crimes began to take on an increasingly ritualistic quality. He wasn't just killing people anymore, he was trying to create something, to build a collection that would serve as a monument to his power and control. Anthony Sears, a 26-year-old aspiring model, became Jeffrey's fifth victim in March 1989. Jeffrey met him at a bar and brought him back to his grandmother's house. He still had access when she wasn't home. After killing Sears, Jeffrey kept his skull and genitals as trophies, painting the skull gray to make it look like a piece of art. This marked the beginning of Jeffrey's transformation from serial killer to something even more disturbing, a collector of human remains who saw his victims not as people but as objects to be acquired and displayed. Moving into the Oxford Apartments gave Jeffrey the privacy he needed to expand his collection. He purchased a large freezer, supposedly for food storage, but actually to preserve body parts. He set up a makeshift altar in his bedroom, displaying skulls, bones, and photographs of his victims in carefully arranged patterns. Jeffrey later claimed that he was trying to create a shrine that would give him a sense of power and control. He wanted to be surrounded by reminders of his conquests, trophies that proved his dominance over life and death. As Jeffrey's confidence grew, so did the depravity of his crimes. He began experimenting with different methods of killing and different ways of preserving his victims. Some he strangled, others he drugged until they died of overdoses. He tried different chemicals for dissolving flesh and different techniques for preserving bones. Most disturbing of all, Jeffrey began experimenting with ways to create zombies, living victims who would be completely under his control. He would drill holes in his victims' skulls and pour acid or boiling water into their brains, hoping to create compliant sex slaves who would never try to leave him. These experiments were uniformly fatal, but Jeffrey continued trying different approaches. He was convinced that with the right technique, he could create the perfect companion, someone who would satisfy his sexual needs and provide him with constant companionship without any risk of abandonment. The victims during this period included Ernest Miller, a 22-year-old dance student, David Thomas, a 23-year-old father of two, Curtis Strader, an 18-year-old high school student, and Errol Lindsay, a 19-year-old aspiring artist. Each represented a life cut short by Jeffrey's insatiable need for control and domination. Jeffrey's method for luring victims had become refined to an art form. He would approach young men at bars or on the street, offering them money to pose for photographs or to come back to his apartment for drinks. His targets were typically young, attractive men of color who were often struggling financially, people who might be tempted by the promise of easy money and who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of Jeffrey's crimes was his progression into cannibalism. This wasn't something that happened immediately, it evolved gradually as his need for complete possession of his victims intensified. Jeffrey later claimed that eating parts of his victims was a way of making them part of him permanently. It was the ultimate form of possession, ensuring that his victims could never truly leave him. He would cook and eat muscle tissue, organs, and other body parts, often saving some in his refrigerator for later consumption. The cannibalism also served a practical purpose: it helped dispose of evidence. Bodies that might otherwise be discovered could be completely eliminated through consumption and chemical dissolution. Neighbors at the Oxford apartments had been complaining for months about terrible smells coming from Jeffrey's apartment. They described odors like rotting meat, chemicals, and human waste. Some residents reported feeling sick when they walked past his door. But when confronted, Jeffrey always had explanations: his freezer had broken and food had spoiled, or he was conducting amateur taxidermy projects. The building's management received numerous complaints, but Jeffrey was a quiet tenant who paid his rent on time and didn't cause obvious problems. In the absence of concrete evidence of wrongdoing, they were reluctant to evict him. Throughout 1990 and 1991, there were numerous occasions when Jeffrey's crimes nearly came to light. These near misses demonstrated both his escalating recklessness and the systemic failures that allowed him to continue killing. In May 1991, one of the most tragic missed opportunities occurred. Conorak Synthesumphone, the 14-year-old brother of the boy Jeffrey had assaulted in 1988, escaped from Jeffrey's apartment after being drugged and tortured. Naked, bleeding from the rectum, and incoherent from the drugs, Conorak stumbled onto the street where concerned citizens called 911. When police arrived, Jeffrey appeared on the scene, claiming that Conorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend and that they had simply had a lover's quarrel. Despite the obvious signs of trauma and the boy's obvious distress, the officers believed Jeffrey and actually helped him bring Conorak back to the apartment. This decision would haunt the Milwaukee Police Department for years to come. Within hours of being returned to Jeffrey's apartment, Conorak was dead. The failure to properly investigate this incident, to run background checks that would have revealed Jeffrey's previous conviction for assaulting Conorak's brother, represented a catastrophic breakdown in police procedure. The incident highlighted several troubling aspects of the case: racial bias. The officers seemed more inclined to believe the white Jeffrey than the Asian victim and black witnesses; homophobia. They dismissed the situation as a gay domestic dispute; and simple incompetence. They failed to notice the smell of decomposing bodies that permeated Jeffrey's apartment. By the summer of 1991, Jeffrey was completely out of control. He was killing approximately one person per month, and his apartment had become a charnel house of body parts, chemicals, and makeshift preservation equipment. His final victims included Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft. Each followed the same tragic pattern: young men lured to Jeffrey's apartment with promises of money or companionship, only to be drugged, killed, and dismembered. Jeffrey's technique had become coldly efficient. He could incapacitate a victim within minutes of their arrival at his apartment, kill them with minimal struggle, and begin the dismemberment process within hours. His freezer and refrigerator were full of body parts, his bedroom had become a shrine to his victims, and the smell of death permeated every corner of his living space. The psychological toll of his crimes was also becoming apparent. Jeffrey was drinking heavily, even by his previous standards, and his behavior at work was becoming increasingly erratic. Co-workers noticed that he seemed exhausted, paranoid, and distracted. Some later said they had wondered if he was having a nervous breakdown. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror finally came to an end, thanks to the courage and quick thinking of Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man who became Jeffrey's final intended victim. Edwards had met Jeffrey at a bar and agreed to come back to his apartment for drinks and conversation. But once inside apartment 213, Edwards quickly realized he was in danger. Jeffrey put handcuffs on one of his wrists and held a knife to his throat, telling him that he was going to kill him and eat him. For several hours, Edwards played along with Jeffrey's demands while looking for an opportunity to escape. He complimented Jeffrey's fish tank, listened to his ramblings about his crimes, and pretended to be willing to watch videos with him. All the while, he was watching for his chance. When Jeffrey momentarily relaxed his guard, Edwards punched him in the face and ran for the door. With one wrist still handcuffed, he fled the apartment building and flagged down a police car on the street. Officers Rolf Mueller and Robert Roth initially thought they were dealing with a domestic dispute, but Edwards's terror was so genuine and his story so bizarre that they decided to investigate. When they arrived at Jeffrey's apartment, they were hit immediately by an overwhelming stench of decay. Jeffrey initially tried to maintain his composure, explaining that he had been drinking and that Edwards was overreacting. But when the officers asked to look around the apartment, Jeffrey became agitated and tried to resist. As soon as Officer Mueller opened the refrigerator and saw a human head, the game was over. The search of Jeffrey's apartment revealed a scene that even experienced homicide detectives would describe as the most horrific they had ever witnessed. Body parts filled the refrigerator and freezer. Skulls were arranged on shelves and painted in various colors. Photographs of dismembered bodies were scattered throughout the apartment. Chemical vats contained dissolving human remains. The bedroom had been converted into a shrine featuring skulls, bones, and preserved organs. Once in custody, Jeffrey Dahmer did something that surprised investigators. He confessed almost immediately and in extraordinary detail. Over the course of several lengthy interviews, he provided a complete account of his crimes, leading police to body parts, explaining his methods, and describing his motivations. Jeffrey's confessions were both helpful and disturbing. He showed no emotion when describing the torture and murder of his victims, speaking about them as if they were objects rather than human beings. He seemed almost relieved to finally be able to talk about his crimes openly, describing them with the same detached interest he might have shown in discussing a hobby. The investigation that followed Jeffrey's arrest was massive. Police had to identify victims from body parts, notify families, and piece together a timeline of crimes that spanned over a decade. The forensic work was particularly challenging because Jeffrey had been so thorough in dismembering and disposing of bodies. Ultimately, Jeffrey was charged with 15 murders in Wisconsin, though he confessed to 17 total killings, including Stephen Hicks in Ohio. The evidence against him was overwhelming: body parts in his apartment, photographs of victims, and his own detailed confessions. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began on January 30, 1992, and became a media sensation. The case raised profound questions about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the nature of evil itself. Jeffrey's defense team argued that he was insane at the time of his crimes, suffering from multiple mental disorders that prevented him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. They presented evidence of his troubled childhood, his struggles with his sexuality, and his progression into increasingly bizarre behavior. The prosecution, however, argued that Jeffrey's crimes were too calculated and methodical to be the product of insanity. They pointed to his ability to hold down a job, pay rent, and avoid detection for years as evidence that he understood right from wrong and was capable of controlling his behavior. The testimony during the trial was graphic and disturbing. Psychiatrists described Jeffrey's sexual sadism, necrophilia, and cannibalism in clinical detail. Police officers recounted the horror of discovering his apartment. Family members of victims gave emotional testimony about their loved ones. Jeffrey himself was largely emotionless throughout the proceedings, showing little reaction to testimony about his crimes or the pain he had caused. This lack of empathy or remorse was perhaps more chilling than the crimes themselves. On February 15, 1992, the jury found Jeffrey Dahmer sane and guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, a total of 957 years without the possibility of parole. Jeffrey's time in prison was relatively brief but eventful. Initially, he was kept in protective custody due to concerns about his safety, but he eventually convinced authorities to place him in the general population, claiming he wanted to find religion and make amends for his crimes. In prison, Jeffrey did appear to undergo some kind of spiritual transformation. He was baptized as a born-again Christian and spent much of his time reading religious materials and corresponding with ministers. Some observers believed this conversion was genuine, while others saw it as another manipulation. Jeffrey's presence in prison was controversial. He received thousands of letters from people around the world, some expressing disgust and hatred, others showing disturbing admiration for his crimes. He gave several interviews to journalists and researchers, continuing to provide insights into his psychology and motivations. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver while cleaning the prison gymnasium. Scarver later claimed that he had been disgusted by Jeffrey's crimes and that Jeffrey had been taunting other inmates by shaping his food into body parts and using ketchup as fake blood. Jeffrey's death at age 34 ended one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. But it also denied closure to many of his victims' families, who had hoped to see him serve out his full sentence. The Jeffrey Dahmer case had profound and lasting impacts on American society, law enforcement, and our understanding of serial murder. From a law enforcement perspective, the case highlighted numerous systemic failures. The missed opportunity with Conorak Synthosumphones led to major reforms in police training regarding domestic violence, missing persons cases, and interactions with minority communities. The case also demonstrated the importance of interagency communication, as Jeffrey's previous conviction for child sexual assault should have been immediately available to officers who encountered him. The case also changed how we think about serial killers and their motivations. Jeffrey's combination of necrophilia, cannibalism, and attempts to create zombies represented a level of depravity that challenged existing criminal psychology models. His crimes were studied extensively by FBI profilers and contributed to the development of more sophisticated approaches to understanding and catching serial killers. From a societal perspective, the Dahmer case forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about race, class, and sexual orientation. Most of Jeffrey's victims were young men of color from poor neighborhoods, people whose disappearances didn't generate the same level of police attention or media coverage that missing white victims might have received. The case highlighted how marginalized communities can be particularly vulnerable to predators. The case also sparked debates about mental illness and criminal responsibility. Jeffrey's ability to function in society while committing horrific crimes challenged simple notions of sanity and insanity. It raised questions about whether someone could be legally sane but morally and psychologically monstrous. While Jeffrey Dahmer's name became synonymous with evil, it's important to remember that his true legacy should be the 17 young men whose lives he cut short. Each of his victims was a person with dreams, relationships, and potential that was destroyed by Jeffrey's selfishness and cruelty. Stephen Hicks, his first victim, was just 19 years old when he died. He had been hitchhiking to a rock concert, looking forward to seeing his favorite bands perform. His family spent years not knowing what had happened to him, hoping he might someday return home. Stephen Twomey was working as a bartender and had aspirations of opening his own restaurant. His family described him as kind and generous, always willing to help others. James Dockstader was only 14, a child who should have had decades of life ahead of him. His Native American heritage made him part of a community that has historically been victimized and marginalized, adding another layer of tragedy to his death. The other victims, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Anthony Hughes, Conorak Synthosumphones, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft, each had their own stories, their own hopes and dreams. Many of these young men were struggling with their sexual identity in a society that wasn't always accepting. Some were dealing with poverty, family problems, or other challenges. But all of them deserved to live, to grow, to find love and happiness. Jeffrey Dahmer stole that from them, and from the families and communities who loved them. The Jeffrey Dahmer case continues to fascinate and horrify people more than 3 decades after his arrest. Books, documentaries, movies, and television shows have attempted to explain how an ordinary-seeming person could commit such extraordinary evil. But perhaps the most unsettling truth about Jeffrey Dahmer is that he wasn't extraordinary at all. He was a deeply damaged person who allowed his worst impulses to completely consume him. He chose evil over and over again, making decisions that prioritized his own desires over the lives and dignity of others. His story serves as a reminder that evil often wears an ordinary face. It doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's quiet, polite, and patient. Sometimes it works at a chocolate factory and pays its rent on time. The Jeffrey Dahmer case challenges us to be more vigilant, more aware of the vulnerability of marginalized communities, and more committed to creating systems that protect potential victims rather than enabling predators. Most importantly, it reminds us to remember the victims, not as statistics or case studies, but as human beings whose lives had value and meaning. Their stories deserve to be told not just as footnotes to Jeffrey's crimes, but as celebrations of the lives that were lost and the potential that was destroyed. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer's true crime wasn't just murder, it was the theft of human possibility, the destruction of love and hope and dreams. That may be the most unforgivable crime of all.